Okay, so tonight's topic, I was just saying to Kevin that he asked me to do this way back in September, which is always a good time to ask someone to do something because we're never too busy. You know, the busyness is going to come in October and onwards. And I just wrote this title and sent it back to him and said, oh, I'll do this. This sounds good. And thinking to myself, well, I've got some stuff on this. We have to talk about it. And I've spent the last 3 or 4 weeks thinking about what to include and what to keep out the lecture. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff that could have gone in, but hasn't. And the other fortuitous thing was that in the Times about 3 weeks ago, there was a piece on virtually the same topic. So I'm feeling that this is very topical at the moment, and just the right time to do it. So a bit of serendipity, in a sense. So perhaps as I go through this, we might be thinking about that. Okay, I'm hoping. There we go. So Kevin said, yeah, I've got some background that I can use for this. I kind of started off as a teacher. I used to teach science in the secondary school before the days of national curriculum, which some of you will only have read about in history books, but was an interesting time because we didn't have a notion of special educational needs. Children came to the school, they were streamed. As a science teacher, I took everybody, irrespective of what their ability was. We had a mixed ability class for science for the exams. We had O-level classes, CSE classes, and we had non-exam classes. Okay, so a very different world from today. We didn't have any teaching assistants, we didn't even know what they were. And we had a group of children in each year group who would go off and talk with the remedial teacher instead of going to English, where they do extra reading and extra spellings. But we didn't talk about special education needs as such. National curriculum came in, I was still teaching. Carried on teaching for quite a few years with national curriculum. And during that time I had one science class, and in that science class there was a child working towards level 1 and another 2 children working towards level 10 and everything in between. Okay, and still no notion of special educational needs, still no notion of a teaching assistant. What was one of them? Really what we had to do as teachers was just work out where kids were at, having worked out where they're at, then to decide how best to teach them the next step. Okay, I then trained to become an educational psychologist, so I came away from teaching for a year, came here, trained to be an educational psychologist, got a job in another part of the country, went down to that part of the country, and there were hundreds of teaching assistants. Every school I went into had teaching assistants, and schools were really keen on having more teaching assistants, and they kept referring children to me so they could get more teaching assistants. And now I've had the opportunity to work here at the university, which has given me some thinking time to reflect and to think about why was it that I could be a teacher with no teaching assistants, never thinking about special educational needs. The only time that a label was used when the parent came in once and said, my child has got dyslexia, do you know what that is? No. Never heard of it. Tell me what dyslexia is. So the parents had to tell me what dyslexia was. Through to being a psychologist, where schools were clamouring to get more support and more teaching assistants. And I've carried on thinking about that through a number of projects that I've been involved in here and before here. I was involved in a project to look at the development of dyslexia friendly with the BDA. And I can remember the first meeting where 10 local authorities got together with representatives from the BDA. And I went down representing my own local authority. And we spent the first hour arguing about what dyslexia was. Okay. Having put that to one side and thought to ourselves, it's not very important really, this definition, we'll just shelve it. What we really need to do is work out how to get schools to be more inclusive. Then working on the Achievement for All pilot evaluation, which is interesting because we're now working on Achievement for All again, but this time it's the national rollout. And then looking at NCSE experience with children with SEN in Ireland, and more recently early school leaving across Europe. So that's given me some ideas to play around with and to keep revisiting those things that came from practice. And I've had the luxury of being able to write a few books around things. And really, books are just thinking spaces. It's just a luxury to be able to think, write what you want, knowing it's not going to be peer reviewed, which is good, so there's no pressure. And you can just get your ideas together and start to think. So those have been my thinking spaces, and they're important to have. Well, I'm going to give you an anecdote to start with. This came from the Achievement for All project, where I went down to meet some of the civil servants who were running the project down at the Department for Education, or whatever it was called at the time, because it keeps changing its name. And it started with me saying to the junior civil servant there, saying, special educational needs, it's really, really messy in practice. It's really unclear as to what special educational needs were. To which I got a civil servant answer, no, it's not. It's defined in law. It's very clearly stated. Let's just explore that a little bit further. You mean that definition that's been around for a while now, since 1944? And it's interesting that this project lasted for 2 years, and we kept meeting this civil servant, and he gradually changed his mind over the 2 years, each time we went down and talked to him a bit more. So my first theme that I'm going to talk about are fuzzy definitions. I put these little theme marker slides in so that you know when I'm changing topic. Okay. So I'm going to start with the definition from 1944, which is, incidentally, has been replicated in all the education acts since, including the most recent act, which has a few tweaks to it, but is essentially the same wording. And so really what it says is that a child has a learning difficulty for the purpose of the act, or whichever act we're talking about, if he has, it's always a he, a significantly greater difficulty in learning than the majority of children of his age. Or he has a disability which either prevents or hinders him from working or making use of educational facilities of a kind generally provided for children of his age in schools within the area of a local authority, or he's under compulsory school age, and the same thing applies. Okay? So if we look at that, there's a bit of a problem with it. One of the problems is that the definition is dependent upon being different from the majority. Oh, well, how big is a majority? Is it 48%? Is it 50%? Is it 52%? When does it become a majority? And the second problem with it is that it's only dependent on the facilities that are available. Well, what happens if we don't provide the right facilities? Then that surely should make more people have SEN, according to this. So it's slightly problematic in that sense, in terms of a definition. Now we could ask the question, well, how are children identified as having SEN? So in some countries, SEN is a kind of reserved label. It only applies to the children with the very severe needs. In some countries, you only get the label SEN if you attend a school which is very different from a mainstream school, a school that we might refer to as a special school in this country. In England, Ireland, United States, quite a few other countries, there's a slightly different model at play which follows the notion of a continuum of need and teachers making a graduated response. So it makes international comparisons really difficult. Just for comparison, this idea of a continuum of educational need across 3 different countries. In England, we talk about quality first teaching as being what the teacher does for everybody. And the better the teacher is, the better the teaching fits for more children. And we then talk about SEN support, which is doing something different for some of the children. And then we talk about education and health care plans, where a very sophisticated assessment has been done. It's usually multi-professional, and we usually end up with a piece of paper called the Education and Health Care Plan. So that's reserved for a small number of children. So you have this idea of a continuum. I prefer the terms in Ireland because they're much more straightforward. Support for all, support for some, and school support plus. Okay, but we're really talking about the same thing. And in the United States, they talk about universal education for everybody. Selective, you're doing something which is specific for a group, and indicated or targeted, which is for a smaller minority. So, we've got different terms. We've got a definition on the one hand, which is legal. We've got a continuum on the other hand, and we've got a messiness around the whole thing. suppose we try and compare one country with another. I came across this paper produced in 2013, which was supposedly comparing different countries. The United Kingdom is split into its constituent countries on there, and just in case you're looking for where we are just there, England. Okay, and I looked at that, I thought, that's not right. It has the incidence of SEN for England has been around 2.8%. If there are any teachers in the room, you'll probably know that's not the case. It doesn't make sense. The incidence is closer to around 20%. So what's going on? It's not right. It seems to only be counting some of the children with SEN, not all of them. Okay, let's leave that for a second. Maybe we could have a system which defines SEN in much more concrete terms, where there are specific labels and each label is well defined. So I have that system in Ireland. It's very convenient. So on here we can see that we have a category which is called general learning difficulties. That's split into different ideas. They happen to use IQ tests, which is a whole other argument, but we'll just put that to one side for a moment. So they happen to use IQ tests as a way of defining what they mean by general learning difficulties. So it's objective in that sense, if an IQ test can be objective. And they talk about specific learning difficulties as being things like dyslexia. Emotional disturbance is split into two categories, specifically speech and language disorders, and then syndromes such as Downs, Williams, Tourette's, physical difficulties, blind and visual impairment, and hearing loss greater than 30 decibels, and autistic spectrum disorder. They use that system as a way of allocating resources. So it's a bureaucratic system. So basically you have to have an assessment. At the end of the assessment, if you hit one of those categories, you get so many hours allocated to you. So again, talking to the civil servants in Ireland about this, I said, oh, okay, on this, your autistic spectrum disorder, get 5 hours support per week if they get the label. But I've encountered people on the autistic spectrum disorder who actually don't need 5 hours support. And I've encountered others where we have an individual who needs 2 adults with them 24 hours a day. Otherwise they're going to injure themselves or injure someone else around them. How can you just allocate 5? It doesn't make sense. So it looks like a nice system in terms of it's categorical. We can identify clearly. However, when you start to allocate resources, the resource allocation doesn't make sense. Okay, it's easy to criticise another country. Let's criticise ourselves a bit more. So in 1944, these were the labels that we used in England. Okay, so we had disability of mind or body. Things like sensory impairments, such as being blind, partially sighted, deaf, partially deaf. Educationally subnormal was a term that was used well into the 1980s. My sister-in-law was a head teacher of a school for educationally subnormal. Educationally subnormal S, which meant severe, but it was also educationally subnormal M, which meant moderate. Then we had, as special educational needs, diabetes, epilepsy, physical handicap, and then emotional behavioural difficulties were split into delicate and physical, and maladjustment, and then we had speech defects. So I can remember when I started working as an educational psychologist, going around a school in Liverpool and being told, this used to be a school for delicate children. And I wondered what delicate meant. Okay, but it meant children who perhaps had breathing difficulties, or they had TB, or they had been bullied in school. It was a whole range of things. And the corridors were outside, so you had to get fresh air as you walked between the classrooms. It's interesting. Don't know if the school is still standing now, but it was an interesting school to visit. And then we have other things on there that we wouldn't necessarily think as being special educational needs now, like diabetes. which is well managed, or epilepsy, which tends to be well managed. There are a few severe cases which end up in different places. Okay. If I pick on one of those and take it a little bit further, maladjusted I'm going to pick on just for the heck of it. Okay. So that became known as a catch-all phrase around about the 1950s. And teachers were simply putting children into that category. And the Underwood report said, well, we'll define it. So a child may be regarded as maladjusted who is developing in ways that have a bad effect on himself or his fellows. I quite like the language in the 1950s. And cannot, without help, be remedied by his parents, teachers, and other adults ordinarily around him. So, if we think about that, maladjusted is having a bad effect on himself or fellows. Well, what the heck does that mean? Bad effect. If I was a teacher thinking about that, if a child, oh, I could do it now. I'd pick up my chair and throw it at you. How do you feel? That's a bad effect. Yeah? Definitely is a bad effect. But what about if I'm a teacher and someone just interrupts me? Is that a bad effect? So, one of the problems with the definition of maladjustment was all types of emotional behavioural difficulties fall into that category. So delinquency, mental illness, social deprivation, poor parenting. It's really hard to work out what's going on. It doesn't tell us. And the NUT at the time criticised its own members by saying it just included all children who might be mildly difficult, such as answering back, chatting at the wrong time. Could easily end up that label, maladjustment. So it sounds like I'm going to do a bit of teacher bashing now, but I just want to come back and just save teachers a little bit from this. And we did a study, just a very small scale study, where we got an unexpected result. What we tried to do was we tried to deliver some cognitive behavioural therapy to a group of pupils, and we matched them with a control group of equally challenging pupils that the teachers were referring to us. And we matched them on a whole range of measures, including self-esteem measures, self-ratings of behaviour, and teacher ratings of behaviour. And we knew that at the start, both groups were identical, if we take the mean values. Half of them got CBT, half of them didn't. And what we expected was to go back and find that the half that got CBT were all much better, and the half who didn't just carried on as normal, and therefore would get poorer results. So we kind of present the intervention. And the intervention group, we looked at their self-ratings, and we found that their self-ratings of behaviour improved more than the control group. So they thought they were doing better. And when we looked at the self-ratings of the control group and compared them with how they were at the start, they thought they were doing much worse than they were at the beginning. So the control group thought their behaviour had got worse, and the CBT group thought their behaviour had got better. So far, so good. That's what we expected. That's what we'd hoped for. Okay, we weren't absolutely sure that's what we were going to get, but that was a good result. But the teacher ratings improved for everybody. How could that be? Well, we have a hypothesis. Okay, it's not been tested. If anyone's looking for a bit of research to do, got a bit of funding, here's something that you might want to try and find out. We suspected that it's really down to teacher capacity to respond. And I can remember what it's like teaching in a classroom and teaching some groups where one or two people were kicking off and it was really easy to manage their behaviour. And then working with another group where 7 or 8 people were kicking off, and that was really hard to manage. And my own resources were limited. And I found it really difficult in a group where I was kicking. So if we have 2 groups of kids, half get an intervention and half improve their behaviour, as a teacher I've now got more resources available to deal with the other half. And now they don't seem quite so bad because I'm able to manage it. Whereas before, when they were all kicking off, oh, it's terrible, they're all bad. Okay, so there's a kind of notion there around teachers are identifying kids with problematic behaviours in this case, which could be labelled as SEN, simply on the basis of their own resources to respond. Okay. One of the things that the English government does, I have to use my words carefully, I was going to say UK then, but it's not really a UK thing, it's more an English thing, is that we have probably one of the best databases in the world. It's called the National Pupil Database. And what happens is information from schools is collected in certain categories, it's aggregated at a local level, and then it's passed to the DFE at central level and creates a database on many characteristics of all the pupils in the country. And one of those categories is SEN. And so in 2014, in the pupil level school census, we have these categories being listed: hearing impairment, visual impairment, multisensory impairment, physical difficulties, profound and multiple learning difficulties, speech, communication and language difficulties, moderate learning difficulties, severe learning difficulties, specific learning difficulties, social emotional mental health difficulties, autistic spectrum disorders, and they've added a category which is called other. Okay? Until 2014 there was no other, which was interesting in itself. So if we compare that with 1944, some of the labels are the same, some of the labels have changed. So the labels that are being used to describe SEN are a bit arbitrary. That's what I want to get from that. Somebody just decided. When we ran our first project around AFA, one of the things that we did, we went to the ethics committee and we said we'll help schools out by pre-populating their surveys with pupils' names that we've got from the National Pupil Database, because it will have the categories of SEN in it. And so when we contacted the schools, we said, we pre-populated it for you, it's going to be easy. Some of the schools rang us up and said, those aren't the kids with SEN. Hang on a minute. You told the DFE that those were the kids with SEN and those were the categories. How come you're now telling us that the kids that we're saying we got from the National Pupil Database in your school are not the kids with SEN? And we got some interesting answers. So one of the answers was, well, actually, teachers don't do this. We've done it once. So we just give it to an admin person, and what they do is they just cut and paste from one year to the next and send it back to the DFE. That's what one school said. Another school said, well, that might have been right at the time that we submitted the data, but of course SEN, kids move in and out of SEN. You can have SEN one day and not the next day. It's not a thing that's for life. And so we can see that the National Pupil Database, best in the world, is a little bit iffy, to say the least. Which is interesting when we come to do research, because we rely on it quite a lot. We then asked teachers which category they thought was the category that most pupils fell into, because we had to ask them then what category each child was. And we looked at the data and we found that their favourite category is not maladjustment anymore. It's changed. Now they prefer MLD. So moderate learning difficulties is now the most popular category that children fall into for SEN. So this is based on around about 450 schools. We did this around about 2010. So it may change over time, but at that particular point, MLD was the most popular category. Okay, why is that? Well, here's my suggestion. A child who's not making adequate progress in literacy can be classified by a teacher as having moderate learning difficulties because they're generally quite slow, severe learning difficulties because they're very slow, specific learning difficulties because they've got dyslexia, and we're talking about literacy, so they can't read or spell very well, a language difficulty because without good language skills then you can't understand necessarily what you're reading, or difficulties might be due to social or emotional or mental health reasons, because my attention is not so good on the reading today because I'm really depressed and fed up, or I'm really anxious about the reading, or whatever it is. So it's really hard for a teacher to work out why someone's not making adequate progress. So if you've got a tick the box on the survey twice a year, you've got to tick a box. So which one are you going to plump for? It's more than likely going to be moderate learning difficulties. So that's the hunch. And really, it's only when we do a multi-professional assessment that we try and work out which of these things it might be in more detail. Well, teachers could do that a bit more themselves. However, we're left with MLD being a popular one. Okay. And often, what happens is because the system is also used to get extra resources into schools, sometimes many assessments are taking place, and the information is not shared for a whole variety of reasons, and so the child ends up with more than one of those labels. So it could be in more than one category, where in fact it's still the same child. There's nothing special about those labels in particular. Okay, is that a problem that's unique to England? Well, no. Okay, I went to Ireland, and they have those very neat categories that I showed you, which are all nicely defined up. We asked teachers in a study there, we wanted to get pupils who had special educational needs in post-primary schools, secondary schools, to talk about their experiences. So we asked teachers to identify them for us so that we could then send consents home to parents, and in identifying them to tell us which of those categories they fell into. Well, teachers didn't tell us any of the categories. What they did instead, I'm going to show you 2 slides very quickly, okay, I'm not expecting you to read them all, they came up with all of these labels, okay, so this is the first slide. So we had 10 categories from the Irish government, but many categories from teachers. The ones in brackets, the numbers in brackets represent how many pupils they were saying that we could have. So we had all of those eating disorders that didn't fit any of the categories at all. English as additional language is not normally thought about as a special educational need in England or Ireland. And then some which clearly fit. Sometimes children getting multiple labels. They went on with even more. Okay, there are some syndromes there, some medical disease conditions there. Dyslexia with one or another thing, physical difficulties, severe emotional problems, specific learning difficulties with and without other things, and so on. So what we end up with is a whole mess of things. Equally, some statistics out from the English government about the kinds of categories that the frequency of each category of SEN. And this is what it's showing. So school support is where teachers are identifying. Education health care plan is where there's been a multi-professional assessment taking place. You would expect, well, one argument is you might expect, perhaps not you would, but you might expect the percentage of SEN to be roughly the same for both categories. Just that the EHC plan is more severe than the other plan, based on our continuum of need. But what we find, it's a bit messy. The 2 things don't correlate very well. It does for visual impairment, hearing impairment, multisensory impairment. The numbers are quite low out of the percentage of SEN. But it seems quite odd that ASD is the highest one for education and health care plans, whereas MLD is the highest for school support. It's quite good that MLD is the highest because that supports the bit of research that we did a few years ago. It's still the same. It's still the most popular choice. Okay, so what we're finding is that the definition of SEN itself is really messy, and that teachers can lump children in because they're making the decision of school support at the school support level. It's no one else making that. So it may be that teachers are doing that simply because they can't quite work out why a child's not making the progress they should. Okay, that's based on labels. Okay, next theme then. Okay, we could approach it in a completely different way. We could say, forget about the labels, forget about the categories, let's just work out what the needs are. Okay, so having decided that the labels themselves are a bit fuzzy, the Code of Practice for SEN 2014 is really helpful. It follows on from Children and Families Act. The first thing we notice is that childhood has been extended if you have SEN. So you're still now a child under this until the age of 25. Okay, which is interesting in itself. Schools must have due regard to the code of practice, must have due regard, okay, doesn't necessarily have to follow it, but must have due regard to it. However, one of the good things I think about the code is it really does emphasise that all teachers are teachers of SEN. And just like in previous bits of legislation, we've had all teachers are teachers of English and so on. So we've been kind of getting that message across a little bit. And rather than focus on categories of SEN, it focuses on areas of need. So I think it's a really helpful thing. So just to give you an idea, it has 4 broad areas of need: communication and interaction, cognition and learning, social, emotional and mental health, sensory and or physical. And if you want to take the DFE categories, how do they fit into that? Well, you can see that the same label is likely to crop up in different places. So ASD, for instance, is going to be a communication interaction difficulty, but you're also going to have some needs in the area of cognition and learning and social, emotional and mental health. Okay, it kind of makes sense. So if we then say to teachers, okay, so now go back to your quality first teaching, how are you going to respond to those children? Do we need to say they've got special educational needs, or can we just respond to their needs without doing that? Well, we could do some quite simple things. So in the area of communication and interaction, we just really need to think about what we say and how we present instructions. We can think about how to get people to work by themselves, or in pairs, or in small groups, and we can differentiate the way that people work. For cognition and learning, we can have stepped instructions. Do this first, then do that. We can backtrack. We can have different levels of challenge. We can summarise learning. If some people work faster than others, we could give them alternate questions so they get some easy ones and some hard ones. There's all sorts of things that we can do which don't require us to refer to children as having special educational needs. And sensory and physical, we can think about technology to support us. We can think about where people sit. We can think about visual aids and so on. Okay. So, challenges with definitions. Thinking about needs versus labels. Is there really over-identification? Okay, so my gut reaction as a practitioner was people were being referred to me unnecessarily sometimes. What's the evidence? Well, DFE, remember I said they produce statistics that are a bit iffy, but they still produce statistics. And if we look at the percentage of children with SEN and no statement between 2006 and 2010, it's going up and up and up and up. Okay, I've stopped my graph at 2010, but we'll come back to that later. Okay, there's another bit to the story to be told. So we might say, well, okay, well, why should we worry? Okay, so we can think about that in different ways. We think about as a system, the education system itself. The argument goes like this: educational resources are finite. There's only a set amount of money, only a set amount of people, only a set amount of schools and places and so on. If we identify some children as having SEN, then we have to direct resources towards them. That makes sense. But because educational resources are finite, that means that we're taking resources away from other children in order to do that. So that potentially reduces the quality of whole class teaching. There's less available for everyone. If we reduce the quality of whole class teaching, then less pupils perform well. And if less pupils perform well, more of them end up being identified as having SCN. If we identify more pupils as having SCN, then we end up in this vicious circle, really. Okay, so because then we have to shift more resources to them. That means there's less available for everyone, so the quality of teaching falls even further. So we end up with more children, round it goes again. Okay. The TES article I was talking about summed it up quite nicely, really. Okay, I'm not necessarily sure that I agree entirely with the statement, but they say it's unforgivable that so many children are misdiagnosed with learning difficulties, diverting help from those with genuine need. Okay, so they're arguing slightly differently. What they're saying is there are some children with real severe needs. Those are the ones who need the help that we're going to give them. Everyone else needs the other resources. If we identify more children, we're diluting the help that we can give. Okay, so that's at the systemic level. We might say, well, okay, what about at the individual level? Well, okay, so here what happens is The teacher identifies a child as being less capable than the peers. Having picked you out, so I picked Kevin out. Okay, Kevin, sorry, but you're useless. Okay, wouldn't necessarily use those words, but you're not as good as everyone else in the room. Okay, so you start to think about yourself as being less capable as an independent learner. And I even reinforce that by coming to give you some, oh Kevin, come on, these are your notes. Good Lord. Okay, so I even come on. And after a while, my expectations of you become lowered, your expectations become lowered, parents become more anxious, and that's really then confirmed because your parents come and give me some hassle as a teacher, so I said, it's okay, what I'll do is I'll get some extra help for him. So I get some extra help for him, and now that really does make him stand out even more. So that makes you become less capable and less independent, lowers everyone's expectations even further. Parents become even more anxious, so they want even more help. Okay. From professional practice, I know that parents go through a system where the teacher gives the child some extra help, thinks that the child's not making progress, they ask the SENCO to give some extra help, think the child's not getting get the educational psychologist in, wander in, we do some assessments, we write a nice report, and then they get a teaching assistant. And the parents then happy. Okay, so what impact has that had on education? Well, let's have a look at the number of teaching assistants. Whoosh. This is a nice steep graph. Okay, since 2000, the number of teaching assistants has increased dramatically, most of which are being paid for through special educational needs funding. So much so that there's now 1 teaching assistant for every 2 teachers in the country. An enormous amount. Some people are arguing it's not just about special educational needs, it's actually education on the cheap, because we have different grades of teaching assistant. We have basic teaching assistants and we have higher level teaching assistants. Higher level teaching assistants have got more qualifications, they're more training, and they're allowed to take a whole class if they wish. So they can cover for teachers who are ill, they can give time off to teachers to do planning, marking, preparation, all those other things that teachers need to do, rather than having a class teacher in the room. Okay, so I might think that's a good thing. There was a study done a few years ago, and these are the kind of headlines that made the press. That giving a teaching assistant to children doesn't always lead to improvement. And so one of the headlines was, pupils using teaching assistants make less progress. That's what came out from the study. Make less progress than they would have done if they hadn't had a teaching assistant at all. So same level of child, one with a teaching assistant, one without a teaching assistant. The one without the teaching assistant made more progress. The authors of the report wrote a much more balanced thing. They said, is it help or a hindrance? And they pointed out the caveat to that. The caveat is that when teaching assistants are well trained, then children generally do make better progress. And one of their recommendations was that in the class, what they often saw happening in the study was that the teaching assistant would work with the children who had special educational needs, and the teacher would work with the brighter children. And in some schools that wasn't the case. In some schools it was the other way around. In some schools the teaching assistant worked with the brighter children, and the teacher, who had more skills and was able to plan and break the curriculum up, worked with the children who had special educational needs. In those schools, the children with SEN made more progress. And while the other children continued to make progress. Okay? So, again, there were more kind of things. So relying on teacher assistants to support SEN classes is a false economy. Okay? So the kind of thing that the government is interested in because of austerity. If we could save a lot of money by getting rid of a lot of teaching assistants, then we could just, well, enough of the politics. Okay. Okay, so we've kind of got something around how support is arranged. We've got SATs and standards. Okay. Let's get in my time machine now and take you back to 1862. The concern of the day from politicians was that public money was funding education and there were concerns expressed about accountability. Some teachers were seen as either incompetent or lazy. So at the time, 1862, classroom would have been about 100 people in it, maybe not, maybe 60 people in it, one teacher, maybe a teaching assistant who would have been a pupil who would have been successful in that class previously, who could help the teacher out, an apprentice teacher. And money was being spent by, I did a comparison, by today's prices it would be about £33 a pupil. Not a vast amount of money being spent on education. So this kind of payment by results was introduced, whereby everybody in the class would be tested. And if you didn't do very well, the school lost a proportion of the money that was being given to the school originally. And there were 3 particular subjects that they were interested in: reading, writing and arithmetic. So the £33 would be divided by 3. If you passed the test for reading, you got to keep £11. Pass the test for writing, you got to keep the £11. Pass the test for arithmetic, you got to keep the £11. Fail all 3 tests, the school lost all the money. So if you were a really bad school and didn't teach anything at all, you didn't get paid anything at all. Or if you're a really bad teacher and you didn't teach anybody, you didn't get paid. Okay, this is way back in time. But that agenda, I think, is still around. It's all driven by economics, really. So as well as being a priority in the 19th century, it continues to be a priority for OECD countries now. It's really about economic competitiveness. So if I put myself in the position of the politicians, then we want pupils at school to do well, because then in the marketplace, they will be able to be competitive as employees, and then the country as a whole will be competitive against other countries, is the argument. So the more people we can get up to a standard, whatever that standard is, then the better. We like to compare ourselves with other countries. And in literacy in particular, we've had various strategies. So we had the National Literacy Strategy introduced in 1998. In the USA, they had No Child Left Behind. In England, we had Every Child a Reader, and there have been lots of other initiatives ever since. Okay, it keeps coming around. And we do some international comparisons of reading to see how we're doing against the other countries. And so these are done every so often. So there are several of these. I've just put 2 of them on here. There's also another one called TIMS, which is about mathematics. So PEARLS is the Progress in International Reading Literacy Study. You can see that in 2011, 49 countries took part, and Hong Kong was number 1. Well done, Hong Kong. And we were 11th. So in the top quarter. When I was at school, being in the top quarter was always a good thing. Okay, that was good. But being 11th, though, was not seen as being a good thing. So what about PISA? That's been done a couple of times. So originally 65 countries in 2012. Hong Kong was 2nd, just knocked off the top by Singapore. And England came in at 23rd. Okay, so top 3rd, thereabouts, not too bad. By 2015, the results for the United Kingdom were aggregated, but you can look at the data and take out England separately. So the United Kingdom came out as 19th. And if you look at the results, we were let down by Scotland and Wales. Okay, it's always interesting to know kind of where each one comes. So if just comparing England, we then came 17th. However, the press at the time said, it's terrible, we've done worse than we did last time. Hang on a minute, we came 23rd last time and 17th this time. Maybe we're not teaching our maths particularly well for politicians and the press to say that we had done worse. We did slightly better, and there were more countries taking part. So if you work it out as a percentage, it's even better. That's always a good way of looking at things. But what this does is it puts pressure on governments. So that's quite a useful thing. Oh, Malta, by the way. I put Malta in because my wife is Maltese. and I was across in Malta doing a lecture where I used this slide and to help them to think about how Maltese education is working or not working. They didn't do so well. So much so that they didn't participate this particular year, and the politicians said, it's terrible that we didn't participate, we'll do an extra one. And so they did their own version of it, supported by the people who developed PISA, to see where they would have come if they had taken part, and it wasn't particularly well. And you can see that they're rather concerned because they're still very low now. It's also interesting that in Malta, the national language is Maltese, but nearly everybody speaks English as well. And when they compared how the children had done in English reading and in Maltese reading, they found that they had done better in English than in Maltese. That seems a bit odd. Well, the problem in Malta is it's a very small population. There's only just under 500,000 people live there. And so if I'm a book publisher, I can't really get much profit by printing books for school children in Maltese, because the only place I can sell them is in Malta, and the population is only 500,000. I can't sell many books. So there's a shortage of books in Maltese. In English, well, if I'm a publisher, there are lots of countries where English is spoken. I can produce lots of books, and there were more books in English in Malta than there were in Maltese. So that's why they did better in English than Maltese. As a result of that, the government said, we need more books in Maltese. And they put their own money into producing books. And there's been a whole project of translating books that are in English or other languages for that matter into interesting Maltese books. Okay. So the PISA headlines are quite useful in terms of it has an effect on politicians. So in Schools Week, Nicky Morgan sprung into action by announcing educational reforms with targets to improve literacy and numeracy for all 15-year-olds and to use PISA 2018, next year, as a measure of the success of the education system as a whole. When things don't go so well, then politicians equally get blasted. So here was Michael Gove getting blasted by the lack of success that we'd had because we came 17th and not higher. And equally, we can have an opposite kind of response, which is where people say, oh, for heaven's sake, don't let test results dictate education. And equally, this is in Malta again, beyond PISA, we need a more balanced and relevant education. So we kind of got a pressure which is on governments themselves about how the education system as a whole is performing. And when the government's under pressure, it generally tries to put that pressure somewhere else. So the way in which our government has done that is to develop league tables and to see how they might influence schools and to try and raise standards. So schools are judged by how well a child performs at the end of the school year, which is July, United Kingdom. Prior to September 2015, primary schools were successful if they enabled more children to achieve a set standard, which was level 4 sets. Okay, it's not too far back in the past, we can just about remember that, by the end of Key Stage 2. And schools with more children not reaching this level were seen to be failing schools. So then we kind of have a question, well, does it mean that all children who don't reach the nationally expected standard have special education needs? I'm going to come back to that in a few seconds. Around about the time that this is going on, in 2007, the Children's Plan set out an expectation that in England, children make 2 levels progress over a key stage. And it also said that children with SEN may make less progress. Okay, and I'll put my health warning on there that levels are no longer reported since 2015, just in case everybody gets picky. Okay, so up to 2015, we would have expected about 7 years you get 2B, 11 years you get level 4, 14-year-old gets level 6, 16-year-old gets level 8. That was the expected standard. Okay, the government did various things to try and help that along. So we introduced the literacy strategy, Okay, which, if we look at the results for the literacy strategy, year on year, all the way up to 2014, this is a new strategy that the government introduced in 1998 to improve literacy. One of the most remarkable things about this is it's a fairly flat line over most of that time. So a lot of money was spent trying to improve literacy, and yet very little difference has been made. Whenever there's a little peak in it, there's usually a change in the measurements. So the peak at the end here, the measurement system was changed. So again, it's all very iffy. But the question in terms of SEN was really, if we're not meeting the standard, then have we got SEN? So if I'm not reaching, just want to see which one most people are looking at, that one over there, okay? So if I take this line over here, then for boys at the start of it, around about 70-something% were reaching the standard. Does that mean that the remainder, the ones that didn't reach the standard, the other 26%, does that mean that they had SEN? Okay. Depends what you do. As a practitioner psychologist talking to teachers, I would think their answer would probably be yes, because they're the ones that they're referring to me. But does it? It doesn't really seem to make sense. Does it also mean, because girls are doing particularly well here compared with boys, I've used the stereotypical colours, okay, then does it mean that more boys have got SEN than girls? In terms of those referred, that seems to be the case. Okay. So the literacy strategy wasn't very successful for reading. It didn't do too bad for writing, actually. So a nice graph going up. But again, does it mean that, again, way back in 1999, that the majority of people had SEN? Because the majority were not reaching the standard. Okay. I don't think that's right either. If we look in more detail at how the children spread, then we kind of get a skewed distribution. For convenience, I put the expected standard in green. This is the one that they should have got. Okay? Now what we can see is that teachers are doing a pretty good job, because 49% of children are exceeding the level that they should have got. That's great. But what we also get is this skew where we get this long tail down towards the bottom. So this B and N stands for below level 2, not even level 1 is recorded on this, just below level 2, or N for not entered. So there's a group of children here, about 5% who are not entered or below the standard. Group 3, level 3 I should say, are also below the standard that we expect. And then we kind of have the majority either the expected standard or above the standard. So does it mean that these have SEN, or does it mean that these have SEN? Or does it mean the whole lot have SEN? Okay. Leave that question really. Okay. So we expect to get a level at the end. However, children enter school at different ages. So if all children develop, this is an assumption, if all children develop at the same rate, then does it mean that those who are older when they start school get a head start and are much more likely to reach the expected standard? Or to put it another way, does month of birth affect teacher judgments about whether a child has special educational needs? And does the type of SEN matter? And does the involvement of outside professionals affect their judgment? Okay, well, we had conveniently a lot of data from our Achievement for All project, where we knew the dates of birth of every child and we knew the categories that teachers were saying the child had. So if you remember, the most popular one was MLD. So we just have a look and see kind of by month of birth what teachers are saying in terms of the number of pupils who have SEN. And we can see it's a line that goes up as the year goes along. So children, the year starts in September, ends in August, then we move on to the next year. So children born in September were least likely to have SEN. Those born in August were most likely to have SEN of any type. So the standard is determining how teachers see children's development. Younger children, if you're a 5-year-old and you're born in August, and you're in the class with children who are born in September, you're 25% younger. That's a lot of development when you're very young, in terms of language skills, physical skills, attentional skills, all of those skills. So we can see or understand why teachers might pick them out. Okay, well, we could do further analysis. We could look at the Mumford effect and the type of SEN, and we see that for the most severe types of SEN, profound multiple learning difficulties, autism, visual impairment, hearing impairment, multisensory impairment, and physical difficulties, the lines are pretty flat. They all require a multi-professional assessment in order to determine what the type of SEN is. So all of those children will have had a multi-professional assessment. There are a few bumps up and down here and there from month to month, but essentially the line goes straight across. When we look at the higher frequency, higher incidence of special education needs, then specific learning difficulties does increase slightly. You may need to look at the numbers more than the lines because of the compression effect of the scale. But we can see that moderate learning difficulties, the most popular one chosen by teachers, has the greatest incline in it. So teachers tend to choose the one with the most popular condition they're putting children in who are younger. Okay. We published a paper on that. Virtually about a week after the paper was published and it appeared, I got a telephone call from Barry Johnson, who is head of assessment for Dyslexia Action. And he said, really interesting paper. We've got some interesting data about pupils being referred to us by their parents. Could you help us analyse it? You can't resist that when you're a researcher, really. You know, someone's got to give you some data. So we had a look at their data and we found exactly the same thing. So in September to autumn to winter, it's fairly flat, and then as spring and summer come on, the incidence of referrals gets higher. So that's where parents are taking their children along for an assessment by a psychologist or a specialist to see if they have dyslexia. So there is a month of birth effect because parents are feeling under pressure as well. Steve, you've got a questioning look on your face.
I'm just puzzled. Sorry, that's when the referral is from the
parents? That's the parents making a referral to Dyslexia Action, which is a charity. It's independent of the education system. Yeah. Now, we don't know whether or not, because I asked Barry whether or not they had any data about which of these referrals translated to real instance of dyslexia. They didn't have that data. They just had the referral data. Yeah.
So, do you mean it's the month in which the season?
The season, yeah, we simplified it to season, yeah. The season of their birth.
Of the birth.
Yeah, of their birth.
Oh, so that's not the season of the referral.
Sorry. Yeah. It's the season that the child was born in, but it's a referral to the Dyslexia Action. Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay. I'm feeling happy that's been clarified now. Thanks both for the questions that prompted me in. Okay, so we could also look and see how much assessment had been done. So at that particular time, the code of practice was slightly different. We had school action, which was basically teachers doing something. We had school action plus, which was where an outside specialist came in. And we had statements, which is where a multi-professional assessment had been done. And so each of the lines shows roughly what's going on. So if we look at the blue line going up first, that goes up by a month across the graph. So that's teachers alone making the assessment and deciding that children have special educational needs. We had some don't knows, but that's the purple line. It's so close to the teacher line, I suspect that was just teachers making the assessment. It follows an almost mirror across the graph. We then had School Action Plus, which was teachers and an outside specialist, which could be another specialist teacher, or it could even be an educational psychologist, or it could be a speech therapist, or it could be any number of specialists going in. It's not as steep as when teachers make the assessment themselves. And then finally, when we have the statement, there's meant to have been a multi-professional assessment done. So these are the children with the most severe needs. And what we can see is that when we get a multi-professional assessment done, there's no month of birth effect. So we can't say it was due that there is a real month of birth effect that might be epidemiological, for instance. It might be caused by a virus. You know, there's lots of colds around in January time. If you're carrying a baby at the time, maybe the baby gets the infection. Maybe that leads to, well, we can see now that that kind of hypothesis really doesn't hold up. It really is down to teachers making an assessment. Yeah, I did say to a group of my MEd students it might be the heat in August that causes it. And they all got a bit worried then. Even in England it gets warm, apparently. Okay. Okay, so what we suggested was it's a bit confusing if we look at your actual attainment level at the end. Achievement level at the end. What we really should be looking at is achievement versus attainment. So instead of measuring attainment, the final level of performance, we suggested to the civil servants that it might be better to measure achievement, where you know every child's starting point individually, and then you set a target which is based on that for that child, rather than an arbitrary target which is set by politicians. To demonstrate this, we devised a single scale to cover all the abilities of the children in the study that we were doing. And on that scale, we expected an average child to make 4 points over the year based on what the government was telling us they should make. Okay, so we were able to compare that. So an average child should make 4 points progress a year. I have to say our ruler was a little bit wobbly in places because we had to pull together different scales that were being used. So there was a foundation scale, there was a Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2 scale, Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4 scale, and they weren't that lined up. But we were able to look at progress made by different groups of SEN. So we kind of have at the bottom the conditions. So those falling into the category hearing impairment made the most progress, more than average children in a single year. Visual impaired, slightly less, right the way down, and the one that we'd expect to make least progress, profound multiple learning difficulties, made the least progress. Okay. When we completed the study over 2 years, we found that the average progress for children with SEN in English was 5.74 points compared to 8 points nationally, so less than average. However, just over a third of the children with SEN exceeded those without SEN. So again, when you look at it this way, you start to question whether they really did have SEN in the first place, because we're measuring it in a different way. Okay, so there've been some recent changes. Levels have gone. Okay, that could be a good thing. It's been replaced by standardised scores. As a psychologist, I quite like standardised scores because it enables me to compare one area of functioning with another area of functioning and one child with another child of the same age. So we should be able to see progress of children with SEN. What we don't know is how finally the age comparison will be. We're going to have to wait till the government publish some statistics to see what that's going to look like. Well, that led me on to thinking about this a bit more in my warped way of thinking. I thought to myself, okay, we should get a normal distribution. Will achieving schools create more SEN, or will they create less SEN? So if I think about SEN, then if I mark on my graph roughly the bottom 20%, which according to our definition earlier on, it's those children who are struggling more than most children, mark that on. Okay, so anyone in that to this side, I'm saying these could be categorised as having SEN, and all of these are doing okay. Or better than okay up here, okay? And we could say, well, okay, that's about 20% of pupils, and if we imagine a percentage that might have the most severe needs, we'd expect that to be around about 2%, because that's roughly how many have got statements in your education and healthcare plans, around about that. So I could mark that on as well. Now imagine that we get a school that's doing really well, okay? So its normal distribution is skewed, and it's slightly to the right. Now if we mark on where their bottom 20% would be, it covers, and compare it with the other school, it actually covers most of that other school. So what will happen when schools start reflecting on standardised scores and SEN? Is it going to create more kids with SEN? If I'm doing okay in one school and then I move to a higher achieving school, do I suddenly gain SEN as a status because I now drop into the bottom 20%? What's going to happen? I don't know. I'm really curious about that. It's really interesting to see what will happen as schools make progress on this new scheme. So, there's a question, something to watch out for. Another area for research if you're looking for a project. Okay, what are schools going to make out of that? Okay, there is an argument that this higher achieving school might have got there by getting rid of some kids, excluding them, throwing them somewhere else, looking for alternative provision. So if we look at what's happening with children with special needs in mainstream schools and what's happening with them in special schools, then one of the things we see is that those with education and health care plans, the number is increasing in special schools. So they're being moved out of mainstream into special. In fact, if we look at this number, it's round about 25% more than it was in 2006. So in 10 years, it's increased by a quarter. Okay, that's got to be due to the fact that there are more kids with severe needs, right? That would be the argument. That would make sense. If more kids are going to special schools, it must be because there are more kids with severe needs. Wow. Government kindly provides data about the percentage of children with statements or education and health care plans. And there's a bit of a wobble up and down at the beginning, but it's roughly about 2.8%, and it stayed about 2.8% for donkey's years. Okay, so there aren't more children in the school population with severe needs. It's stayed about the same. And why shouldn't it? That makes perfect sense. Unless there's been some drastic change in society, human beings are not getting any different. Maybe there's more pollutants. Maybe that would explain why. Maybe there's more radio. I don't know. Maybe aliens are coming and invading. No, the statistics suggest it's staying the same. Okay, so what we have then is more children moving into special schools. And if we look at the percentage of the school population in special schools, because you might say, well, it's just raw numbers, that last graph, just raw numbers. So if we look at the percentage out the school population that go into special schools, we can see that's increasing as well, from round about 82,000 thereabouts in 2006, and the percentage is gradually increasing. It's not a large increase, but we've got 105,000 children now in special schools. It's slowly increasing, children are being moved out of mainstream into special, it would appear. Okay. Okay, DFE data kind of supports that. And we categorise as having SEN severe enough to warrant a statement or education and healthcare plan remains 2.8% and has been constant since 2007. There has been an increase in the percentage of pupils with a statement or plan attending special schools. And it's gone up from 38.2% to 42.9% of those children. So what's the government's response? Spend more money, spend it on whatever you like, but including whatever you like, build more special schools. Okay, so I'm feeling slightly irritated by that. Because after all, I'm interested in inclusion, and this sounds like it's going in the opposite direction. It's not really helping. Okay, so that's my next theme. My next theme then is really psychometrics. Interested in psychometrics, that's what I quite like as a psychologist. I quite like psychometrics, they're useful. But sometimes when you talk to teachers, they don't really understand tests. They use them, but they don't really understand them. And so it kind of leads to reading tests causing a bit of panic. Because what they do is they say, oh, Mrs. Smith, your 10-year-old son, he's got a reading age of 8. And the parent goes, oh, panic. Okay? So what I've done here is I've taken one of the reading tests that's used in schools, also used by psychologists. You can have the slides later. Okay. And what this shows is the bottom end of average and the upper end of average. This table doesn't appear in any of the manuals. I had to go through manually and work out what all the scores were and then look them up and see what the reading ages would be if you got that many words right. But a reading test works on the basis that a reading age is given at the level where half of the children of that age would pass those number of items and half would fail. That's how reading age is defined. So if I'm 6 years old, there should be a 50-50 chance that I would have a reading age of 6. And half of 6-year-olds will have a reading age slightly higher than that, and half would have a reading age slightly lower than that. So by looking at the spread for average, the average spread based on a normal distribution, then we can have a look at this. So if I'm a 4-year-old, the lowest score I can get on this test is to not get any words right, but I've still got a reading age of 4. Okay, I've not got any words right, but I've still got a reading age of 4. And the upper average range would be 4 years, 8 months. I mean, I'm over 51, okay, just about, a couple of weeks ago. So if I look on that, if I do this test, because it's also used for adults, then bottom end of average, I'd have a reading age of 15, and upper end of average, I'd have a reading age of 16. And the test doesn't go any higher than that. There's a test ceiling. The maximum you can have is 16. So we can see there's a spread. So if I take my 10-year-old child with a reading age of 8, is there a need to panic? No, because that's just the bottom end of average. That is the average spread. That's okay. So that initial panic of, I'm 10, but I've only got a reading age of 8, if it's on this particular test, that's okay. I don't need to panic. But what if I didn't understand that, then I look at it and think, I'm 10, reading age of 8, that's terrible, I'm 2 years behind. That's how it's phrased when teachers and parents talk about it. So I have to see someone to help me catch up. Okay? Well, no you don't. You're doing okay. So the test itself can cause people to think about SEN. I did an analysis a few years ago when I was writing one of my first books to see what kind of levels of reading you actually need to access a text based on a study that had been done before. And also looking then at how children of different abilities would do. So the blue line is showing the reading age that you need to access text at different years in secondary schools and primary schools. So the way that was done was the study that produced that data went into secondary schools and primary schools, took all their textbooks and worked out what the reading age was and then gave an average for each of those. So we can see that when you get to 15, you need a reading age in months of 120, which is conveniently 10 years. Okay? So you can be 5 years behind and you can still read the text. That would be okay. So then we look at kind of the level that children on the bottom 2% would get if we look on a standard reading test. In this case, the British Ability Scale, which is one used by psychologists. And you can see that bottom black line gradually increases and they get closer and closer to being able to read the text that's presented in front of them on average. And if you're on the 20th centile, which is in just the bottom lower end of average, not quite bottom end of average, then you actually start off being able to read it and it gets easier and easier and easier as you get older. So what you can see is the challenge of reading text in school gets less as you get older. So there's even less need to panic. And usually most of the panic comes, Kevin, at what year? Just trying to drag this from your professional practice. 11, yeah. Just when kids are moving from primary to secondary. Because everyone says, oh, I'll never cope in secondary. So we get a huge ward of children being identified as needing assessments at the end of primary school. The data says actually it gets easier in terms of reading. Okay, so reading tests cause panic. People's thoughts about reading tests cause panic. That leads us to identify more children as having SEN. My next theme picks up on the funding. Now, fortunate enough to be reasonably old and to have been around a while funding has been discussed. And the system used to be that if you had special educational needs, the school would identify it, they call in a specialist who would do an assessment, usually an educational psychologist who would do an assessment, write a nice report, and then you present that to the local authority who cough up some extra money. And the money is then used to provide additional support. And the way that the local authority used to get the money is it used to delegate funds to schools, but it used to keep a lot back. It used to do what's called top slicing. So they take the money back, schools get a certain amount of budget, and then they apply for additional funds from the budget that's been kept back to support children who are struggling. Does that all make sense? That's the way the system used to work. Okay, I'm not sure how it works now because there are so many different funding arrangements, but that's how it used to work. The Audit Commission looked at this and said, look, it's all a bit silly. It's all a bit silly because, first of all, if we look at which children have got statements, most of them are in mainstream schools. 34% of those back in 2002 had moderate learning difficulties, the most popular category that teachers assign. At the same time, most exclusions in mainstream schools are cared for children with SEN, suggesting that the needs are not being met by that system. And they looked and they worked out how much money was being used on the process of just producing a statement. And we were quite interested in the local authority that I was working in working out, well, how much money do we spend producing a statement? So we added up the salaries of all the people for the amount of time that they would spend. Back in, I think it was about 2003 we did this. So there was assessment officers, there were specialist teachers, there was a bit of teacher time in the school that was spent on assessment, there was the educational psychologist, the most expensive bit, and then there were some other bits that go around it. And then actually managing and allocating the money and all those financial arrangements. And we worked out that for one assessment back in 2003, it was costing about £2,500 to do the assessment. And then we looked at what the school got at the end of it, and they usually got about 600 quid. And it doesn't make sense. So we kind of agreed with the Audit Commission. And maybe one of the things that we could do is to give money to schools directly and stop this nonsense. So we decided to do that. We just gave money to schools and said, here it is, you've got it. If you want an assessment, you can have one, but there's no more dosh. Okay, there's no more money. The time when I was just doing my doctorate, and I relied on the fact that schools were supplying me with lots of children with quite easy needs to identify. They were all dyslexic. And I was interested in dyslexia and working out what was the best way of teaching these kids. And so my participant pool was all the people that were being referred to me. We didn't have UREC, we didn't have to worry about any of that. That was way back. So as long as I got parents' permission, I could go and assess them and do all that kind of thing. And the assessment would also help the school to get the funding that they wanted. So it seemed like a win-win situation. I would get my participants, they take part in the study, we'd work out which way of teaching worked best so that the teachers could get on with the job of teaching them, and at the same time the school would get some extra money from the local authority because they were still doing an assessment at the same time. Sounds great. We changed the way that we gave the funding out. We said, we're not giving you funding for that anymore. So the schools stopped referring those children to us. Instead, they referred the children that they had real difficulties with. Now, those children must have been in the school in the first place. They didn't suddenly create them. But now, as a psychologist, it's much more interesting being a psychologist because we're working with really difficult, challenging cases. Children who, despite the best efforts of teachers, were not learning or not behaving or had other difficulties. In terms of my doctorate, flipping heck, where were all my participants? I had to find another way to get them. So changing the way that money was allocated in the local authority where I was working seemed to make a difference. It seemed to change who was being identified as having special educational needs. That's interesting because we've had a similar change recently in legislation, where schools are now expected to spend £6,000 meeting a child's special educational needs before they ask for any more. Okay, I'm not sure how local authorities are auditing that, or whether they're auditing that, but in principle that's what's meant to be happening. Remember that graph I showed you where the incidence of SEN was increasing with time? Since those changes and some other changes have been made, it's all started to go down. So the number of children now being identified by teachers as having special educational needs, because these are the ones without plans, is decreasing. So my thought about it is that this is really to do with money, in the sense there's no more money available, resources are finite within the school, resources are getting tighter within the school. You can't keep allocating money left, right and centre to more and more children, so you've really got to think about which ones you are targeting. Does that make sense as an argument? Okay. Now, again, we don't know if that's the real case. That's just a hunch, just a hypothesis. So if anyone's still looking for another research project, there's probably another one in that somewhere to try and find out if that's how teachers are thinking. But we can see the number of pupils is going down. Might also be that from around about 2010, thereabouts, that's before the financial crisis, local authorities were still making austerity cuts at that point, before the financial crisis. And the local authority I was working with got rid of all of its support services, except for the psychologists. So if there were no support services going into schools around about that time, then you might imagine the teachers can't see the point of identifying children with SEN because there's no one going to come in and help them anyway. So that might be the start of the dip, and then we've had the severe cuts in local services since, severe cuts in health services as well as educational services that schools rely on. Okay, so there's been a number of themes. I think all of these contribute really to over-identification, that we've had fuzzy definitions, we're not clear about what SEN is. We've had, on the one hand, the Department for Education collects data based on category, yet recommends that teachers teach based on need. And the two things don't fit together very well. We've had changes in funding that seem to have an influence. We've had political pressures on SATs and standards that put teachers under pressure and therefore emphasise which children they'll work with and which ones they won't, or whether or not they want more teaching assistants to help more children reach the level that's expected. We've had the problem of not understanding psychometrics very well and therefore giving the wrong message about psychometric data. And we've had the growth in alternative provision and the promise of even more. So I think all of these factors, and there are more that I'm not talking about tonight, are influencing over-identification of SEN. Okay, as a researcher, why worry? Well, okay, we make certain assumptions as researchers. We think that SEN is well defined. It's not. It's very problematic. There's a lack of agreement about who has SEN. And if we look at subcategories and subtypes, we make lots of assumptions. And if we read other people's research, we make assumptions about the kind of participants that they have. So if I read about dyslexia, which is one of my interests, if I read Maggie Snowlin's work, I know that she picks her participants in a particular way, that not all dyslexics are the same. And as far as she's concerned, if you don't match her definition, you ain't got dyslexia. But another researcher who focuses on different aspects of dyslexia would have a different population. So how can I compare that piece of research with this piece of research? It becomes really difficult. Also because there's a continuum, if I'm talking about autism, for instance, how bad is the autism, or how, we don't really know. The researcher just mentions it as so many children with autism. It's really hard to determine whether they're the person who can cope by themselves or the person who needs 2 adults within 24 hours a day. It's really hard. So it makes comparisons across studies and between studies really challenging. It has implications for generalisability and replication. So there's a kind of feeling, this is for you now, because you asked me about this at the beginning, to trust no one, as Mulder would say. Okay? However, as researchers, we know it's really messy, really, don't we? We don't really make those assumptions. We know that there's still things to be learnt from one study to another. We know that we can make generalisations across. We can pull out themes and threads and so on. We can combine quantitative research with qualitative research and so on. And really, that's the second thing that Mulder says. the truth is still out there. Okay, if I'm right, that should be my last slide. Good. Okay. Okay, so I'll take questions, points, discussions. Yeah.
Garry, what do you think about the role of parents and interest groups? I mean, you've talked a lot about the interrelationship between local authorities and schools.
Yeah, my first draft of the slides, I had something in about that, but I realised I'd be out of time if I talked about everything. So there's certainly my work as a practitioner suggests that what happens is you get a label, and then people find some identity within the label, and parents find it comforting to have a label, as well as being a tool for getting additional resources, additional support. And so you then get parents with children with that label forming support groups. And it's not long before support groups become pressure groups to try and influence decisions one way or another politically. So I think that does have an influence. The report that the TES was referring to, there's another article in the TES which talked about pushy parents. So the parents are really putting pressure on teachers. What it didn't say is that that was a survey of teachers rather than a survey of parents. So we know that from that study that teachers feel that parents are putting them under pressure. And it's probably potentially groups like the BDA who say all children with dyslexia need lots of support as a blanket statement, where in fact there's a continuum of need and some don't need much support at all. Some would just need, like the students we have who come here, there are some who have quite severe difficulties in the area of dyslexia, and some who putting things on Blackboard in advance is all you need to do. Because they're independent learners, they can cope with that, they can pre-read, they can prepare for the lecture and so on. So there's a whole spectrum which pressure groups tend to ignore.
Do you have a view about that issue of the clamour for resources? Because it's put me in mind of, I was a teacher at a similar time to you, and I remember I inherited a class group, and I was told that of the 25 children in my class, 17 had been referred to the educational psychologist. And I was called to a meeting with the educational psychologist, and I think there was an expectation that I was meant to maybe identify the needs of these 17 children. But in honesty, what I said was, I don't know why these 17 children have been referred to. There are 3 of them I'd like to have more information about, but beyond that, I don't think we're struggling, we're doing okay together. So what you mentioned kind of the pressure for resources, and perhaps there's an element in there in the kind of role of pressure groups. So what is the clamour for resources about?
My personal view, no data to back this up. It is a bit like you described, really, that parents become anxious. They want the best for their child. You can't blame them. Teachers at the same time are in a really difficult place, between a rock and a hard place, so to speak, because on the one hand they should be more inclusive, yet on the other hand they have to reach a standard, and you can't do both necessarily or very well. And so extra resources seems to be a solution which placates parents because it calms them down. Yes, we're doing something. It's a bit like cough mixture, really. The cough mixture is no use whatsoever medically, but you feel good taking it. So we can give me some resources, give me a teaching assistant, because they're not that expensive compared with a teacher. And you'll feel better about it, even though the teaching assistant doesn't know what the heck they're doing, because there's no communication in the classroom, all sorts of things that might come from that. So I think the pressure is a perceived pressure, it's a social pressure, rather than a real educational need. And the thing that you may have done this as well, your professional role, is you try and work with schools to remove barriers to learning, because then more children will benefit. And some of the pressure groups are responding to that. So we now have autistic-friendly schools, we have dyslexia-friendly schools, who are all working on that general inclusion philosophy of trying to remove barriers for particular groups of pupils. When we did that in Staffordshire for dyslexia-friendly, one of the things that we found was we had 2 levels of training. So we had basic training and then we had advanced training, which we call level 1 and level 2. The schools that did level 1, when we looked at their SATs performance at the end of the year based on the government statistics, which are really iffy, then we found they performed better than schools that had no training, and those who had the full training did better for all pupils than those who had level 1 training. So there's a kind of argument that if you concentrate on a particular group and think about how their needs might be met, you become a better teacher for everybody. Yeah. Again, yeah, straying into Mel Ainsco's territory a little bit. Yeah, Steve.
Next question about the reading age data.
Yeah.
Get your view on that, because I haven't really understood how it worked before, and I can see why most parents don't understand how reading age is calculated.
Yeah.
So I just wonder whether your take is that is it an issue that it's you demonstrated that it's misunderstood?
Yeah.
Is that because it's misnamed, or do you think it's because it's misconceived? What's your take on whether this is a useful way to approach the issue?
Yeah, I think it historically the concept of a test age comes from IQ tests originally, where people were struggling with the maths or thinking of what 100 or 110 meant. It was much easier just to convert it into a mental age, because then you could group children according to their mental age and teach them in that way. In some countries that's what they did. In this country we've resisted that a little bit, and we've had children taught in chronological ages. But the concept of mental age comes from there. So it's an easy way of comparing people, because on the original IQ test you had so many items, 30 items. An average child of 10 would get so many right, so whatever that average age of that 10 number of items is, you then equate to a mental age of 10. Yeah, so you give it to a load of 10-year-olds, half get, say, 10 items right, and half get less than 10 items right. So that becomes the mental age. So that's where it's come from, really. So then we apply it to other things like reading age, spelling age, writing age, number age. All of those things can work in the same way, because it's a concept that's fairly easy to understand. If we take 100 people, 50 of them will have this level of ability in that area. Yeah. It gets confusing when we're talking about an individual. Yeah, because when we talk about the individual, then it's great if you're spot on. You feel really good about yourself if you're one of the ones who gets slightly higher, and you feel terrible about yourself if you are one of the ones who scores slightly lower. But we'd expect natural variation, there to be a spread, just like there's a spread in heights. So we could have height ages if we wanted to. We don't talk about that, but we could. We could look at how tall all 10-year-olds are, and we could work out where the 50% point is, and that's your height age. And there are people who are below that, and there are people who are above that. That's just how it works. And reading age is the same. We only really need to be concerned when you're miles behind. But how far is miles behind? It depends on the test. So one of the problems is you have a reading age on one test, you have a different reading age on another test, and a different reading age on another test, because they're all standardised in different ways. And that becomes really difficult to work out. So, the teacher does the Salford reading test. You get a very simple test, and you get a reading age of X. Psychologist comes in, does a more sophisticated test, and your reading age is even less, or sometimes even higher, depending on which way it goes. How do you understand that? And then you get professional arguments about who's right. Well, actually, everyone's right. There's just different measures on different tests. Okay, it's like measuring you in kilometres and measuring you in metres, and measuring you in inches. Okay. Yeah.
More of a practical question, really. When the funding changed and the schools stopped referring you pupils when you were doing your PhD, you said that you had to find another way to find your participants.
Yeah.
Just wondered how you did that.
How? I was really lucky that I worked for an educational psychology service, and we didn't have to apply for UREC to get our ethics cleared, because all I did was I contacted all my colleagues and said, would you mind going through your files and finding me anyone you've assessed in the last year who was dyslexic, and I'll write to the parents and see if they'll allow their child to take part in this study. Okay, so I don't think UREC would allow us to do that now. Okay, but at the time, it seemed to be okay. My supervisor thought it was okay. That's all that mattered. Okay.